The highways of Florida stretched endlessly under a scorching sun, asphalt shimmering with heat and the distant hum of traffic. These roads were meant to carry people safely from one town to another, but for Aileen Wuornos, they became a stage for desperation, vengeance, and ultimately, death. Born in 1956 in Rochester, Michigan, Aileen's early life was a portrait of trauma and neglect. Abandoned by her father, subjected to abuse by family members, and thrust into adulthood far too early, her childhood was marked by hardship and instability. By the time she was a teenager, Aileen had experienced more suffering than most endure in a lifetime, a bitter foundation for a life that would spiral into violence. She fled to Florida, searching for stability, money, and independence, but found only more struggle. Living on the margins of society, she turned to sex work as a means of survival. Along the lonely highways, she met men who offered cash in exchange for company, companionship, and sometimes more intimate services. Yet in these encounters, a pattern of manipulation and danger emerged, both from the men she serviced and from the societal forces that ignored her plight. By the late 1980s, Aileen's life had become a mixture of survival and growing anger. She claimed later that her victims were threats, men who had attempted to assault her, rob her, or otherwise harm her. Whether true in every instance or an element of her own narrative, the result was terrifyingly consistent. Men died violently, shot at close range, usually along isolated stretches of Florida highways. The murders began subtly, almost imperceptibly. A trucker, a traveling salesman, a man seeking temporary company. Each victim disappeared, leaving little trace behind. Local law enforcement often wrote these disappearances off as isolated incidents, failing to recognize a pattern. But for those who would later investigate, the connections became chillingly clear. A single woman, operating alone, turning the highways into her hunting grounds, wielding a weapon with deadly precision. Even as the bodies mounted, Aileen's life remained a fragile mixture of poverty, addiction, and fleeting connections. She had a transient network of friends, lovers, and acquaintances who witnessed parts of her life, her outbursts, her charm, her volatility, but few could have predicted the scale of what she would do. The highways, the deserted parking lots, the abandoned rest stops all became silent witnesses to acts of violence that society seemed unwilling to see. And yet Aileen was not simply a monster. She was a product of trauma, circumstance, and societal neglect. Her story is as much about the failings of the system, of law enforcement, social services, and community as it is about the choices she made. The complexity of her psyche, the interplay between survival and aggression would define both her crimes and the fascination they inspired worldwide. By the time her killing spree fully escalated, Florida highways had become both literal and metaphorical landscapes of terror, roads where trust, hope, and life itself could vanish in an instant. By 1989, Aileen Wuornos' existence had become a dangerous rhythm. The highways stretching endlessly, the sun beating down on asphalt, the hum of passing vehicles masking the tension that accompanied her every encounter. For the men she encountered, what seemed like an ordinary transaction or a fleeting companionship often ended in violence. Her method was chilling in its simplicity and precision. She typically approached men under the guise of sex work, luring them to isolated areas along Florida's rural roads, abandoned rest stops, or secluded parking lots. Once alone, the encounters would turn fatal. She claims self-defense in many cases, insisting that the men had attempted to assault her or rob her. Whether true or partially fabricated, the result was the same: death by close-range gunfire, leaving her victims sprawled across sand, gravel, or dirt roads, silent witnesses to a pattern that had eluded authorities for months. The killings began sporadically, almost imperceptibly. Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old man, became her first confirmed victim, lured to a remote area where she shot him multiple times. His disappearance drew little attention at first. Missing person reports in Florida often went unresolved, especially when the missing were adults traveling alone. Each subsequent murder followed a similar pattern: David Spears, Charles Carsgadan, Troy Burris, men who disappeared, only to later be found shot to death, evidence pointing to a single perpetrator operating along the highways. As the body count rose, law enforcement slowly began to notice a pattern. The victims were all men, mostly strangers, who vanished along isolated stretches of road in Florida. Witnesses described a woman with striking features, hair often dyed or hidden under hats, who was seen offering rides or companionship to men who would later be found dead. But Aileen's careful planning, mobility, and understanding of the terrain allowed her to evade capture, slipping in and out of towns, blending into transient communities, and using the roads themselves as both hunting ground and escape route. Her life during this period was a precarious balance of survival and rage. She lived out of cars, abandoned buildings, and friends' homes, constantly on the move. Addiction, poverty, and past trauma fueled a volatile temperament that surfaced in both public and private spaces. Those who crossed her path, briefly or intimately, often glimpsed both charm and menace in the same person, a duality that would later captivate and horrify the public. The Florida highways, quiet in the early hours and bustling by day, became theaters of terror. Each murder carried a psychological signature: isolation, close-range execution, and meticulous disposal. Evidence was sparse, often concealed in vegetation or shallow graves, sometimes washed away by rainfall or overlooked by passers-by. In essence, Aileen turned the environment itself into an accomplice. The winding roads, thick foliage, and abandoned areas of Florida hid the traces of her crimes. By the time the first pattern was confirmed, the public was largely unaware of the danger lingering along these stretches of asphalt. Families reported missing loved ones, but few could connect the dots. The media, initially dismissive of the disappearances of middle-aged men along rural roads, gradually began to take notice, reporting sporadically on stranger deaths in Florida. Aileen herself oscillated between fear and audacity. She was aware that the law could catch up to her, yet the combination of anger, survival instinct, and trauma drove her to continue. Her narrative: the men threatened her, they forced her hand, mingled with the cold reality of her actions. 7 confirmed murders, each executed with methodical precision, leaving an indelible mark on the Florida landscape. By the end of this act, the highways of Florida were no longer just roads. They were stages of terror, silent witnesses to a woman shaped by hardship, trauma, and desperation, who had become a predator in plain sight. The tension now shifted from isolated disappearances to a city and a state beginning to realize that a serial killer moved among them, hunting along the highways and leaving death in his wake.
By the early 1990s, the state of Florida was becoming increasingly uneasy. Reports of missing men, often middle-aged and traveling along rural highways, had begun to surface more frequently. Families of the disappeared grew frustrated with the slow pace of investigations, while law enforcement scrambled to find connections between cases that spanned counties, towns, and stretches of road that seemed endless. For investigators, the breakthrough came through careful pattern recognition. They noticed that the victims shared several similarities. All were men traveling alone. All had last been seen interacting with a woman offering companionship, and all had met violent ends along remote highways. The details were chillingly consistent. The close-range gunshot wounds, the shallow disposal sites, and the fleeting descriptions of a female suspect. Witnesses began coming forward. Truckers, motel clerks, and residents along the highways provided fragmented accounts. A woman offering rides, asking questions, or waiting for customers at roadside stops. Each testimony helped construct a profile. A woman, transient, familiar with the isolated highways, operating with audacity and precision. Law enforcement began to realize they were not dealing with a random killer, but a methodical predator exploiting the vulnerabilities of the men she targeted. Meanwhile, Aileen continued her activities. She lived a precarious life, moving between towns, sometimes staying with acquaintances or friends who provided temporary shelter. She carried weapons, planned encounters, and maintained a veneer of normalcy while executing her crimes. The highways remained her domain, silent and empty at night, but deadly under the guise of chance encounters. The investigation gained momentum when police began connecting physical evidence to missing persons reports. Shell casings, vehicle descriptions, and witness statements coalesced into a clearer picture of her movements. Detectives realized that a single individual was likely responsible for a series of murders that had long confounded the system. But locating her remained a challenge. She was transient, careful, and aware enough to avoid patterns that could lead directly to capture. The tipping point came when Aileen's behavior grew bolder and more erratic. She was increasingly relying on stolen vehicles, changing her appearance, and interacting with more people who could testify to her presence. One key encounter involved a potential victim who survived, providing authorities with a vivid description and critical details that helped them track her down. Finally, on January 9, 1991, Aileen Wuornos was arrested in Volusia County, Florida. She had been driving a stolen vehicle, and the circumstances of her apprehension reflected both her desperation and the meticulous work of law enforcement. The arrest was tense. She was combative, defiant, and at times eerily calm, traits that mirrored her complex personality. Once in custody, Aileen's story began to unravel. Investigators confronted her with evidence linking her to multiple murders. She confessed to 7 killings, claiming that each was committed in self-defense against men who had threatened or attacked her. Her confessions, chilling and detailed, provided a window into the mindset of a woman shaped by trauma, fear, and survival instincts, yet capable of lethal violence. The public reaction to her arrest was intense. Headlines painted her as a female serial killer, a rarity in criminal history, and speculation ran rampant about the nature of her crimes. The case drew national attention with debates about morality, gender, and justice, dominating media coverage. Was she a monster, a product of circumstance, or a combination of both? The answers were complex, unsettling, and impossible to ignore. The courtroom in Volusia County was thick with tension, the air heavy with anticipation and grief. Families of the victims filled the benches, some in silence, others shaking with barely contained emotion, their eyes fixed on the woman accused of taking their loved ones from them. Across the room, Aileen Wuornos sat quietly, her demeanor at once detached and inscrutable, a mixture of defiance and fatigue etched into her features. The trial, which began in 1992, was a complex battle of narrative and evidence. Prosecutors meticulously laid out the timeline of her murders, describing each encounter, each isolated highway, and each fatal confrontation. They presented witness testimony, truckers, motel clerks, and surviving acquaintances painting a chilling portrait of a predator who operated under the guise of desperation and vulnerability. Physical evidence played a crucial role. Ballistics linked her handgun to multiple victims, and forensic analysis confirmed the locations and sequences of the killings. Investigators recounted how Aileen had lured men to remote areas, often promising companionship, only to commit murder when she perceived a threat, a defense she would repeatedly assert during the proceedings. The defense, meanwhile, focused on her troubled past. They highlighted decades of trauma, abuse as a child, abandonment, exploitation, and a life lived on society's margins. They argued that her actions were driven not by malice alone, but by fear, desperation, and mental instability. Psychiatric evaluations were presented, offering a glimpse into a mind scarred by neglect and abuse, a woman whose perception of threat and survival had become inseparably intertwined. The courtroom drama was compounded by the public fascination with a female serial killer, a rarity in criminal history. Media coverage was relentless, portraying her as both monster and victim, a figure whose actions provoked both revulsion and a morbid curiosity. Editorials debated morality, gender, and justice, questioning how society's failures may have contributed to the sequence of events that led to her crimes. As testimony unfolded, the gruesome details of the murders were laid bare. Survivors recounted their narrow escapes, while investigators described the precision and brutality of each killing. Aileen's confessions were read aloud, revealing a chilling mix of calm narration and erratic emotion. She detailed the killings as moments of survival, yet her words carried an undercurrent of resignation and inevitability, as if the highways themselves demanded these acts. The trial reached its climax when the jury deliberated the balance between justice and circumstance. The verdict was inevitable, yet shocking in its gravity. Aileen Wuornos was convicted of 6 counts of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to death, receiving 6 consecutive death sentences to be carried out by lethal injection. The weight of her crimes, combined with the calculated nature of her actions, left little room for leniency in the eyes of the law. Public reaction was a mixture of outrage, horror, and reflection. Families of the victims experienced a form of closure, tempered by decades of grief, while society grappled with the broader implications, the intersection of trauma, survival, and murder. Scholars, psychologists, and journalists debated the meaning of her actions, exploring the blurred lines between victimhood and culpability, and the societal failures that allowed her to operate undetected for years. By the end of the trial, Aileen Wuornos' story had cemented itself into the collective consciousness. She was more than a criminal. She became a symbol of desperation, rage, and the devastating consequences of a life shaped by abuse and neglect. Florida's highways, once silent witnesses to her killings, had become a cautionary tale, roads that concealed terror, revealing the darkness that can lurk beneath ordinary surfaces.
If you enjoyed today's video, we thank you very much. Please like and subscribe to Rare Breed Chronicles. And let's dive into another story that defies the ordinary.